They said Rome had 1,000 gods, but none as hungry, none as feverishly alive as the one who walked among them wearing a crown. His name was Gaius Caesar Germanicus. History would remember him simply as Caligula. He began like every promise of a golden age does, the young emperor, the smiling son of a hero, the dawn after tyranny. When he first stepped onto the marble floors of the Palatine Palace, people threw flowers at his feet. They whispered that mercy had returned to Rome. But mercy, like marble, can crack under the weight of madness. As months passed, something inside the emperor began to shift, something divine or perhaps something unholy. After a sudden illness that almost claimed his life, Caligula awoke not as a man reborn, but as a god convinced. Jupiter himself, he declared, has chosen me as his living vessel. And from that day, Rome's capital became a temple of flesh. The altars no longer held incense, they held skin. The prayers were whispered not to heaven, but to his name. Within those glittering halls of gold, the boundaries between holiness and hunger melted away. He built shrines to himself, demanded that senators kneel when he passed, and ordered that his statue be placed in the holiest sanctuaries of the empire. But perhaps the most terrifying transformation was not in the temples, nor in the laws he rewrote. It was in the hearts of those who obeyed. Because when a ruler believes he is divine, his people begin to fear that he might be right. Tonight, we return to that age of marble and madness, to a time when a god's laughter echoed through palace corridors, and the holiest rituals began on satin sheets. This is not merely the story of Caligula, the mad emperor of Rome. It is the story of how desire, when crowned, becomes religion, and how one man turned the empire of the gods into the brothel of heaven. Long before Rome trembled at his name, he was just a boy, small, sharp-eyed, and far too silent for his age. His name was Gaius Caesar, but the soldiers called him Caligula, Little Boots, because he'd toddled through their camps wearing miniature sandals and armor, the adored mascot of his father's legions. They cheered when he laughed. They thought he was lucky. But in Rome, luck is just another word for a brief delay before disaster. His father, Germanicus, the golden hero of the empire, died suddenly. Poison, they whispered, poured by jealous hands under orders from the Emperor Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, screamed treason until her voice became a death sentence. She was banished, starved to death, her bones scattered in exile. His brothers were hunted, imprisoned, erased. And the boy? He was spared, but not saved. Tiberius, his great-uncle, called him to Capri, the emperor's private island, a place of marble villas and moonlit perversions. There, Caligula learned the language of fear before he could recite poetry. The island was a paradise only in appearance. Behind its frescoed walls, men vanished after a whisper. Women wept behind golden masks, and blood was washed away with wine. He dined with his uncle, the old emperor who smiled like a snake in sunlight. He watched courtiers flatter and betray each other in the same breath. Sometimes, a man would be executed mid-meal, his body dragged out past the plates of figs and roasted peacocks, and the boy, small, quiet, staring, was told to keep eating. Each lesson was carved into him with invisible blades. Trust no one. Love nothing. Mercy is weakness. By the time Caligula reached manhood, the boy who once played among soldiers had become something else entirely, a creature forged in the furnace of survival. He had learned that in Rome, you don't win power, you inherit its ghosts. They say people aren't born monsters. They are taught, carefully, methodically, until cruelty feels like faith. And every night, as he lay in his marble bed on Capri, surrounded by statues of gods, the child dreamed, not of freedom, not of his lost family, but of the throne. Because for him, the nightmare was never the darkness. The nightmare was the crown.
When Emperor Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, Rome sighed in relief, as if the empire itself had been holding its breath under a storm that had lasted too long. The Senate rejoiced, the crowds poured into the streets, and all voices rose for the new emperor, young, handsome, beloved Caligula, the son of the divine Germanicus. For a brief and shining moment, Rome believed in miracles again. He began with gestures that felt like sunlight after years of shadow. He freed prisoners, recalled exiles, and ordered grand games for the people. Gold poured from the treasury like wine, sacrifices smoked from every temple in his honor. The people shouted his name as if it were a prayer. "Gaius! Gaius Caesar!" they cried. And for the first time in years, Rome dared to hope that its ruler was human. But power is a mirror that reflects not the face, but the fractures. Just months after his coronation, Caligula fell violently ill. Fever gripped him, and for days Rome trembled, fearing the death of its new son. But when he awoke, the emperor who opened his eyes was not the same man. Some subtle fracture, had shifted behind them. The sickness had burned away the last of his humanity, leaving only divine delusion behind. He no longer walked as an emperor. He strode as a god among insects. He declared himself Jupiter reborn, the thunderer in flesh. The temples of other gods were stripped of offerings, their treasures melted to fund the construction of his own shrines. He demanded that senators bow as they approach, that sacrifices be made not for him, but to him. And when one senator hesitated, Caligula smiled, sweetly, almost tenderly, before ordering the man's entire household executed. He called the moon his wife, ordered divine banquets with himself as host and deity, and conversed with statues, whispering secrets only God should hear. Rome laughed at first, then it stopped laughing. The crown had fused to his skull, melted by the heat of his madness. The boy who had once learned that mercy was weakness now ruled an empire with that same creed, only now he called it faith. And so the marble temples of Rome began to fill with fear. The incense burned thicker. The prayers grew quieter. Because when the man who wears the crown believes he is a god, every kneeling subject becomes a sacrifice waiting to happen.
The Palatine Palace, heart of imperial Rome, had always been a temple of marble, order, and power. Under Caligula, it became something else entirely. A cathedral of flesh, where the sacred and the profane melted into one pulsing ritual. By imperial decree, the palace's grand atrium, once reserved for senators and priests, was transformed into what he called the House of Jupiter's Bride. Incense drifted through golden halls thick as fog. Silver braziers glowed like stars upon the mosaic floors. From the ceilings hung silks dyed an imperial purple, moving gently with each breath of the summer wind. And beneath them, the gods, his gods, were no longer carved from marble. They had skin, they moaned, they bled. He announced to the Senate that Jupiter, the father of all gods, had returned in mortal form. He pointed to himself. The senators clapped through trembling hands. And then came the decree. The wives and daughters of Rome's noble families would henceforth offer themselves as votives in the new divine rituals to honor the living God. Refusal meant treason, resistance meant ruin. The city whispered in horror, yet none dared speak aloud. Each night, carriages rolled silently up the Palatine Hill, bearing noble women in veils, their faces pale beneath torchlight. They were greeted not by priests, but by soldiers. Each was led into the temple-turned-palace, where the ceremony began. Trumpets sounded, not of war, but of worship. The air filled with the heavy sweetness of myrrh and rose oil. A voice,
Caligula's, rose in chant, solemn and ecstatic. Through flesh the divine descends. Then the music shifted. The prayers dissolved into breath and movement, the sacred drowned by the sound of bodies meeting in submission. Laughter, sighs, and sobs echoed beneath the frescoes of gods looking down. Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, all witnesses now to a perverted divinity. From the corridor beyond the temple doors, a lone Roman priest once wrote what he saw. He dare not enter, but through the crack of the marble gate he glimpsed the impossible. The emperor himself, crowned with golden laurels, his body glistening in lamplight, his sister Drusilla beside him, his proclaimed goddess Juno. Around them, nobles and slaves alike entwined in chaos, their devotion measured not by prayer but by surrender. He wrote, "The god spoke, and in his eyes I saw nothing but the madness of a man who had forgotten he was mortal." Every ritual ended with the same act, the emperor standing upon the altar, lifting his hands to the heavens. Gold and blood mingled on his skin as he shouted into the night, "I am not to be prayed to, I am the prayer itself." The crowd roared in ecstasy and terror alike, as if afraid silence itself might be punished. The lamps flared, the perfumes thickened, and beneath the vaulted ceiling of painted angels, the empire's last shred of virtue burned away like oil. Because when a man believes himself divine, every boundary, moral, human, sacred, becomes meaningless. And when desire wears the robe of religion, sin begins to smell like sanctity. Witnesses said that in those nights the palace no longer felt Roman. It felt cosmic, feverish, unreal. Marble gods looked down at the spectacle below as if ashamed of their own worshippers. The mosaics glittered with reflections of moving bodies, of golden cups spilling wine and blood together. The laughter that echoed through those halls was no longer human. It was the laughter of something ancient and broken, crawling out of the skin of a man. Outside, the city slept uneasily, the moon turning the Tiber River to liquid silver. And across the water, those who had once prayed to Jupiter began to wonder if the god of thunder truly lived again, or if Rome had finally crowned a demon and called it divine. Inside the palace, Caligula rested against the altar, breath shallow, eyes glassy with triumph. Around him, the remnants of his worshippers lay scattered like offerings, half asleep, half ashamed. And above them, painted on the ceiling, the face of Jupiter stared down in silence. For even the gods, it seemed, had no words left for what man had done in their name. The empire that once knelt at his feet began to tremble beneath him. The incense still burned, the trumpets still sang his name, but behind every bowed head there grew a quiet, coiled hatred. The senators whispered, the generals stared too long. Even the priests, once drunk on divine privilege, began to pray for deliverance from the God they had created. Caligula had gone too far. He taxed temples, mocked Jupiter, and ordered his own statue to be placed inside the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. He laughed at omens, tore apart sacred scrolls, and replaced hymns with his own name. The divinity, he claimed, had become a contagion no one could bear to breathe. And so the plan was born not in bravery, but in exhaustion. It was whispered among the Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect him. They had seen too much. Too many corpses, too many desecrations, too many nights of madness disguised as miracles. Their commander, Cassius Charia, a man Caligula humiliated for his voice and mocked with obscene gestures, became the blade that Rome's trembling hand would wield. It was late January, the air heavy with wine and smoke. The emperor was attending yet another nocturnal ceremony in his temple of Jupiter's flesh. He moved through the golden corridor, his white robe trailing like fog. Laughter followed him, the kind that doesn't belong to joy, but to delirium. And then it happened. A sound broke the rhythm of the ritual, a footstep out of place, a breath too close. Caligula turned, and before his divine mouth could form a curse, the first dagger struck. Then another, and another. They said there were more than 30 wounds. He fell upon the marble floor, his own altar, his blood pooling with the spilled wine, the oil lamps flickering in the sudden draught. The god had become mortal again, not by revelation, but by rupture. The great temple echoed with no prayers, only the wet sound of knives and the gasp of the dying emperor. When the last breath escaped his lips, Rome exhaled, slowly, like a fever breaking. They burned the silks, shattered the statues of his face, and dragged the golden idols into the streets. Priests tore their vestments, senators wept, soldiers watched in silence. By dawn, the empire that had been heaven on earth smelled of smoke, blood, and rain. And in the ashes, someone whispered the words that would outlive the empire. Never trust the man who says he is a god.
History never speaks only of madmen. It speaks of the world that allowed them to rise, the courtiers who smiled, the priests who blessed, the people who knelt in silence while a man declared himself divine. Caligula was not born a god. He was sculpted by fear, by worship, by the intoxicating perfume of unchecked power. Every empire breeds its own deity. Sometimes he wears a crown, sometimes a uniform, sometimes a suit and a perfect smile. And always, behind him, there stands a crowd that dares not say no. The story of Caligula is not a relic of marble and myth. It is a mirror. It asks, what happens when desire is sanctified? When cruelty is disguised as divine will? When pleasure is preached as salvation? The answer has never changed. When absolute power meets absolute lust, sin becomes sacred, and humanity becomes a congregation of ghosts. Today, the Palatine Hill is silent. The gold is gone, the idols have crumbled, and the marble halls are no more than ruins bathed in moonlight. But those who walk its paths at night say they still hear footsteps echoing through the stones, soft, deliberate, eternal, the restless stride of a fallen god, wandering among the ashes of his temple, searching for another altar, another audience, another chance to be adored. And as the night wind sighs through the ruins, a whisper rises with the sound of distant ceremonial drums. Caligula, the man who turned the Roman Empire into a brothel for the divine.